They have now learned that the United States seized two oil tankers within hours of each other, including a Russian-flagged vessel that had spent weeks dodging American forces. And tonight, a new demand is coming straight from the Kremlin. Yes, the Russians are desperate to get their tanker back. What almost no one is discussing is that this seizure represents a massive reset of the global balance, and it is extremely bad news for Moscow. The oil on that tanker was sanctioned, illegal crude originating from Venezuela, a former Russian puppet state. That oil was propping up not only the Venezuelan regime, but also the governments of Iran and Cuba, while at the same time helping to sustain Russia's war effort. Right now, Russia's puppet states are collapsing together, and that reality has officials in Moscow worried that they could be next. Tonight, the United States carried out a bold seizure of two oil tankers accused of transporting sanctioned Venezuelan oil, including a Russian-flagged ship that had been evading capture for weeks. What this action is doing is slowly suffocating Vladimir Putin. It is like being caught in a chokehold where you are willing to do anything to escape, because if you don't, you pass out or make a desperate and reckless mistake. Near Iceland, the Russian-flagged tanker known as the Marinera, previously called the Belawan, was finally seized after being pursued by the U.S. Coast Guard. The ship was deeply tied to Venezuela's illegal oil trade and had managed to avoid capture for weeks. There is a direct line that can be drawn from Venezuela across the Atlantic and straight into Russia's war in Ukraine. Russia's own oil exports fund its invasion, and the strategy has always been carrot and stick. The carrot is simple: end the war in Ukraine, cooperate, and the West will buy your oil again. The stick is just as clear: continue down this path and you will be slowly strangled with no way out. The little game Russia has been playing, evading sanctions while fueling America's enemies, is now over. Almost no one is talking about how the situation in Venezuela allowed the United States, under the Trump administration, to pressure Russia in ways never seen before. The rusting tanker that was seized was part of Putin's shadow fleet, ghost ships designed to dodge Western sanctions and keep cash flowing for his endless war while propping up hostile regimes. What makes this terrifying for Russia is how easily it happened. The Coast Guard chased this tanker for weeks as it tried to reach a friendly port and return home. Under a federal warrant, the U.S. simply took control of it for hauling stolen, sanctioned Venezuelan crude, even while it was being escorted by a Russian submarine. It was supposed to be protected, but it wasn't. There was nothing Russia could do to stop the seizure, and now the rest of its shadow fleet is on notice. Oil is the lifeline of Russia's war machine, and without the ability to evade sanctions, launder money, and coordinate with America's enemies, it becomes impossible to fund chaos in Ukraine, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Once that stops, Russia finds itself isolated and backed into a corner by the Western world. What is most alarming for Moscow is the realization that its ships are no longer safe anywhere. U.S. helicopters carried out dramatic pre-dawn operations. Elite Coast Guard teams rappelled onto tankers like the Sofia in international waters near the Caribbean, while near Iceland, the Marinera was finally taken after earlier attempts had failed. All of the fear-mongering about the Russian Navy being unstoppable suddenly looks hollow. The tanker was escorted, Russia tried to signal strength, but in the end the ship was taken and the oil is now headed for the U.S. Strategic Reserve. That sends a message far louder than any submarine ever could. This seizure signals the end of Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. If their ships are not safe and their puppet regimes are collapsing, they have no business projecting power here. Without Venezuela and Cuba as platforms, Russia cannot threaten the United States, and its reach shrinks dramatically. Crews were reportedly painting Russian flags onto the ship in a desperate attempt to deter seizure, while Moscow demanded the safe return of its sailors. All of this is part of a larger strategy to control Venezuela by controlling its purse strings and energy resources, allowing oil sales only if they serve U.S. national interests. For decades, an axis of regimes, including Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, helped each other evade U.S. sanctions, enriching themselves and buying military hardware to threaten their neighbors. That era is ending. The message to Venezuela's interim leadership was clear: oil production can resume only if ties with America's adversaries are severed. Venezuela, despite having massive oil reserves, destroyed its own industry through corruption and mismanagement. It relied on Russia and Iran to refine its crude, shipping oil across the world and receiving partially filled tankers of gasoline in return, just to keep cars running and allied regimes afloat. This situation also sends a message to India, currently the largest buyer of Russian oil. For years, sanctions existed on paper, but never were enforced. Now, enforcement has begun. The message is simple: continue buying sanctioned oil, and there will be consequences. India pursued cheap energy for its people, which is every nation wants, but that was possible only because past US administrations failed to enforce sanctions. That tolerance is over. With oil accounting for roughly a third of Russia's economy, cutting off those markets makes endless war unsustainable. Secondary tariffs and sanctions are now being used to enforce the rules peacefully. Countries can still buy Russian oil if they choose, but they will pay for it through tariffs when they do business with the US economy. This offsets any advantage gained from cheap fuel. By cutting off Russia's oil revenue without firing a shot, the US forces Putin to decide how badly he wants to continue the war. The endgame is cooperation, trade, and peace, but first the pressure must be applied. If India replaces Russian oil with Venezuelan oil under US oversight, everyone wins except Russia. India gets cheap energy, Venezuela rebuilds, US companies return, and Russia loses leverage. At the same time, low oil prices weaken America's enemies who rely on energy revenue. What is happening now is the peaceful collapse of an interconnected network of hostile regimes. Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China, and Russia function like stacked blocks. Pull one from the bottom and the entire structure begins to fall. Putin is being suffocated economically, pushed to the point where reckless decisions become tempting. The simple solution is obvious: end the war in Ukraine, cooperate with the global economy, and choose peace over tyranny. This entire shift comes from enforcing existing US laws. Law and order applied consistently leads to peace, lower energy prices, and prosperity for people trapped under oppressive regimes. Multiple governments are collapsing without war, purely through pressure and enforcement. What we are witnessing is a rare moment of common sense, strong leadership, and strategic victory achieved without firing a shot. The question now is how Russia responds and how much worse things get before it finally chooses a different path.